The air was thick with silence, heavy and unnatural. The moonlight barely filtered through the broken blinds, casting jagged shadows on the worn carpet. A single bulb flickered in the hallway, its buzzing the only sound in the house. Detective Claire Harper tightened her grip on the flashlight. The Bennett house hadn't been touched in years. Dust coated the furniture, thick and undisturbed. The smell of mildew clung to the air, sharp and sour. She glanced at the file in her hand. A family of 4, brutally murdered in 1987. No suspects. No answers. Until now. The creak of the floorboards under her feet echoed too loudly. Her pulse quickened. Something about this place felt wrong. A photograph on the mantel caught her eye. The Bennetts, smiling in front of the house. A perfect family. Claire's stomach churned as she looked closer. The father's eyes seemed to follow her, hollow and accusing. She turned away, uneasy. The file had led her here, a clue buried in decades of cold case reports. A neighbor, now elderly, had recalled a man visiting the Bennetts the night they died. No name, just a face. The man in the shadows. The sound of a door creaking broke her thoughts. Her breath caught in her throat. She swung the flashlight toward the noise. The beam landed on the basement door, slightly ajar. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She stepped closer. The scent of decay grew stronger. She reached out, her hand trembling. The door groaned as it opened wider. The stairs led into darkness. The air was damp and suffocating. Claire hesitated, then descended. Each step groaned louder than the last. The flashlight's beam trembled, illuminating the walls. Marks scratched into the concrete. Long, deep, deliberate. A shiver ran down her spine. She paused, listening. A faint sound. Breathing. Her chest tightened. She wasn't alone. Something shifted in the shadows below. Her flashlight flickered. And then she saw it. A figure, hunched and motionless, staring back at her. The eyes reflected the light, unblinking. Her scream caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, its outline barely visible in the trembling beam of light. Claire's grip on the flashlight tightened, her palms slick with sweat. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the sound of her own breathing, ragged and shallow. The figure's eyes glinted again, catching the weak beam. Claire's heart thundered in her chest. She took another step, her legs shaking. The air grew colder with each second, the dampness seeping into her bones. Her flashlight flickered again, threatening to plunge her into total darkness. "Stay back," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Still. The figure remained still. But something else stirred, a sound. A low, guttural noise, like a growl. Claire froze. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The growl grew louder, reverberating off the concrete walls. And then the figure shifted. Slowly. Too slowly. It rose to its feet, impossibly tall, its head brushing the low ceiling. Claire stumbled back, nearly losing her footing. Her flashlight caught its face for a fleeting moment. A mask. Not a face at all, but a grotesque, featureless mask, cracked and yellowed with age. The growling stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears. Her mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, before stepping forward. The floor groaned under its weight. She stumbled back further, her heel catching on the edge of a broken step. She fell hard, the impact jarring her spine. Her flashlight tumbled from her hand, spinning wildly. Darkness engulfed her, save for the faint, erratic beam now pointed at the ceiling. The sound of footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate. She reached out blindly, her fingers scraping against the rough concrete floor. The growl returned, this time closer, vibrating through her chest. And then it spoke. A voice low and guttural, like gravel scraping against steel. "You shouldn't have come here." Claire's scream finally tore free. Claire's scream echoed through the basement, bouncing off the walls and disappearing into the void. The figure stopped, its head cocking slightly, as if savoring her fear. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out rational thought. She scrambled backward on the cold concrete, her fingers digging into the damp floor. The flashlight, lying just out of reach, flickered weakly. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice repeated, slower this time. Each word dragged through the air like a knife against stone. The mask gleamed faintly in the dim light, cracked lines forming a grotesque grin. Claire's breath hitched as her back hit the wall. No escape. Her hand brushed something cold and metallic. A pipe. She wrapped her fingers around it instinctively, gripping it tight. Her knuckles turned white. The figure took another step, its heavy boots crunching on unseen debris. Closer now, she could see the edges of the mask more clearly. It wasn't just old, it was stained. Dark streaks, dried and flaking, ran down from where eyes should have been. Blood. Claire's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. The growling returned, vibrating through the ground. It wasn't just coming from the figure. It was coming from all around her. The shadows seemed to move, alive and writhing. Shapes slithered and twisted in the corners of her vision. She swung the pipe wildly, her instincts taking over. "Stay back," she yelled, her voice cracking. The figure paused, tilting its head again, as if amused. Then it lunged. Claire barely had time to react. The pipe connected with a sickening thud against its shoulder. It staggered, but only slightly. The growling grew louder, furious now. She scrambled to her feet, adrenaline surging through her veins. The flashlight's beam caught something on the wall behind the figure. A door. Barely visible, half hidden by shadows. Her only chance. Without thinking, she bolted toward it. The figure roared, an inhuman sound that froze her mid-step. But she didn't stop. She reached the door, her hands fumbling for the handle. It was locked. Behind her, the footsteps quickened. Her heart pounded as she clawed at the rusted lock, desperate. And then she felt it, breath on the back of her neck. The breath was hot, damp, and smelled of decay. Claire froze, her trembling fingers still on the rusted lock. A low, guttural chuckle rumbled from behind her, sending chills down her spine. Her instincts screamed, "Move." She spun around, swinging the pipe blindly. It connected with something solid, and the figure let out a guttural snarl. Claire didn't hesitate. She turned back to the door and threw her weight against it, desperation giving her strength. The old wood groaned, the lock straining under her force. Another step behind her. Heavy, deliberate. The figure was closing in. Claire shoved harder, her shoulders slamming into the door repeatedly. Splinters bit into her skin, sharp and stinging. The lock finally gave with a metallic snap, and the door burst open. She stumbled through, the pipe still clutched in her hand. Darkness swallowed her whole as the door slammed shut behind her. Her chest heaved, her breaths ragged and uneven. She reached for her flashlight, only to realize it was gone. The only light came from faint cracks in the wooden door, streaks of dim, flickering orange seeping through. She pressed her ear against the door, straining to listen. Silence. No growling. No footsteps. Had it stopped? Her heart raced, adrenaline coursing through her veins. But then, faintly, she heard it. Scratching. Soft at first, like nails on wood. Then louder, more frantic. The figure was on the other side, clawing at the door. Her stomach twisted, and she stumbled back, nearly tripping over something on the floor. The air in the new room was heavier, colder. It reeked of iron and something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. Her hands fumbled in the darkness, searching for something, anything, to defend herself. Her fingers brushed against a chain. Cold and sticky. She yanked her hand back, but not before something slick clung to her skin. She wiped it on her jeans, her stomach churning. The scratching stopped abruptly. Silence. Too much silence. Then a voice.
Low.
Mocking. You can't hide forever. The words seeped through the cracks like poison. And from the corner of the room, something moved. A faint rustling sound came from the corner. Claire's breath hitched, her body frozen as she strained to see through the suffocating darkness. The sound grew louder. Deliberate.
Wet.
Something dragged itself across the floor, its movements unnatural and uneven. She backed away, her hand searching the wall behind her, desperate for support. Her fingers found cold, damp stone. The pipe felt heavy in her grip, but the weight was small comfort. The rustling stopped. The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. She dared a whisper. "Who's there?" No response. The silence stretched, every second a cruel eternity. Then, from the corner came a soft, clicking sound. Rhythmic. Inhuman. Claire's stomach clenched. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the noise. It grew louder, closer, as if the thing in the darkness was crawling toward her. The air shifted. She could feel it now. A presence. Low, guttural breathing emerged from the blackness, uneven and labored. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything. A faint glint caught her attention. The flashlight. It lay on the floor, just a few feet away. But between her and the flashlight was the source of the sound. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. She didn't have a choice. With every ounce of courage she could muster, she lunged forward, diving for the flashlight. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal just as something cold and wet grazed her ankle. She yanked her leg back, scrambling to her feet. The flashlight flickered to life, casting its weak beam across the room. The light fell on it, a twisted, crawling thing. Its limbs were impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bones. It had no eyes, just sunken, empty sockets. Its mouth, jagged and gaping, twisted into a grotesque smile. The creature hissed, its body jerking toward her. Claire stumbled backward, the beam of light shaking wildly. The creature shrieked, its voice piercing and raw, and lunged. The door behind her burst open, and the masked figure stepped inside. The door slammed open with a deafening crash, the impact shaking the walls. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The masked figure, looming tall and dark, stepped into the room. The creature froze for a moment, its head snapping toward the intruder. The tension in the air thickened, like something about to snap. The masked figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, its hollow eyes locked on the creature. The room felt suffocating, every breath painful. Claire backed away, the flashlight shaking in her hand. The creature made the first move. It hissed, slithering toward the figure, its limbs twitching in unnatural jerks. The masked figure's head tilted, as if considering the creature. Then, without warning, it moved. A flash of motion. It was faster than Claire could comprehend. The figure reached out, grabbing the creature's arm with impossible strength. There was a sickening crack as it wrenched the creature's limb from its socket, the sound echoing through the room like breaking glass. The creature let out a shrill, bone-chilling scream, but the figure held it firm. Claire's body screamed for her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She was trapped. She watched as the figure twisted the creature's body, its movements brutal and precise. A crack. Another shriek. The creature went limp in the figure's grasp.
But it didn't die. It twitched.
Then a low rumbling sound echoed from within the walls, like a growl, so deep it rattled the very bones of the house. Claire's head snapped toward the noise, her breath catching in her throat. The walls were moving, shifting. Shadows writhed in the corners, pulsating like living things. A whisper echoed from the darkness, a voice that sent a chill crawling up Claire's spine. "You think it ends here?" The figure's head snapped toward the voice. The creature's body hung loosely in its grip, no longer fighting. But the shadows continued to swirl. The figure didn't answer. It dropped the creature to the floor with a sickening thud and turned toward the corner. Claire's eyes darted back and forth, searching for an escape. But the shadows were closing in. Something was wrong. The air itself felt wrong. The house was alive. The walls were breathing. The corners were moving. The figure was still. But the room was no longer empty. The air thickened, heavy with an unseen pressure. The shadows in the corners shifted, coiling like smoke, undulating with a life of their own. Claire's chest tightened as the room seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. It wasn't just the creature and the masked figure anymore. The walls groaned, the floors creaked, as if the house itself was coming alive. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. It came from all directions now. "You can't escape," it hissed, as though the house was speaking directly to her. "It knows you." Her skin crawled with dread. The flashlight flickered wildly in her hand, casting fleeting glimmers of light that illuminated nothing. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a shadow shifting too quickly to be real. Her heart hammered as she turned her gaze back to the figure. It stood motionless, staring at the swirling shadows in the room. Its hollow eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The creature, lifeless on the floor, twitched again. Claire took a step back, her mind racing for a way out. There was nothing, no windows, no doors. No escape. And then she saw it. A door, hidden in the farthest corner of the room, barely visible in the shifting darkness. Her pulse quickened. It was a chance, a small hope. She turned toward the door, her feet carrying her without hesitation, her body driven by pure instinct. But as her foot touched the floor, a deep growl rumbled from behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't dare look back. The shadows were stretching, reaching for her, clawing at the air. The whisper grew louder, more frantic. "It's coming." The room seemed to tighten, closing in on her. The darkness thickened, swirling around her, suffocating her. And then, a sharp, jagged pain. It felt like a cold hand gripping her ankle, pulling her down. She screamed, her body jerking violently as she tried to break free. But the shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were solid, like iron chains, binding her to the floor. She tried to tear away, but the grip tightened, dragging her back. She reached for the door, desperate. Her fingertips brushed against the cold wood, but she couldn't reach it. Her body was being pulled back toward the center of the room. Her pulse surged in panic. The growling grew louder. The whispers, no, they weren't whispers anymore. They were voices. Multiple voices. All speaking at once. "You can't run from it. It knows you. It remembers you." The figure stood in the corner, watching her struggle, its head tilted like a predator savoring the moment. And then it spoke, the words a hollow echo that filled the room. "It's too late." The air grew even colder, biting at Claire's skin as the shadows pulled tighter around her. Her fingers clutched the door, desperate, but it refused to open. The whispers surged, rising like a tide. The voices were everywhere, clawing at her mind. She could barely think, her head spinning with their words. "You're trapped. You're all alone." The shadows that had been moving slowly now surged toward her with terrifying speed. They weren't just shapes anymore. They were claws, sharp and hungry. They scraped across the floor, the sound like nails on a chalkboard, grating and awful. Claire screamed, her body jerking as the shadows wrapped around her limbs. She could feel them sinking into her skin, cold, slick, and suffocating. Her heart raced, her breath shallow and panicked. The growl grew louder, shaking the floor beneath her, vibrating through her chest. From the corner of her eye, she saw the figure step forward. Slowly, deliberately. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed to smile. Not a comforting smile. A cold, cruel thing. Claire's body was fully bound now, the shadows tightening their grip around her like iron shackles. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her throat tightened as the figures stepped closer. Each movement felt impossibly slow, as if it was savoring her fear. It crouched in front of her, its mask inches from her face. Claire could feel its presence like a physical weight, pressing against her chest. The cold of the mask touched her skin, sending a shiver through her bones. And then it spoke again. "You should have never come here." Its voice was low, dripping with malevolence. The shadows hissed in response, curling tighter around her. Her head spun. Her pulse echoed in her ears. "It remembers you." The figure's voice was sharper now. "It knows you." Claire's eyes widened. Her breath caught in her throat. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She didn't understand. What did it mean? But before she could process, the figure reached out and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look directly into its hollow eyes. And then, the room went silent. The shadows stopped moving. The growling ceased. Everything went still. The stillness was suffocating. "You're part of it now." The figure's voice was barely a whisper. And then, Claire's world shattered. In the blink of an eye, everything twisted. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were memories. Her memories.
Her past.
And in that moment, Claire understood. The house. The shadows. The whispers. It had never been a mystery. It had never been a crime. She had been part of it all along. Claire's mind reeled, the truth crashing over her like a wave. It wasn't just the Bennetts. It wasn't just the house. It was her. She was here for a reason, for a purpose she had never understood until now. The shadows were a part of her. The whispers had always been there, buried deep within her, calling her to return. Her breath became shallow as she tried to fight the gnawing realization. She had forgotten. But now, as she stared into the mask's hollow eyes, it all came back. The faces of the Bennetts, those perfect, smiling faces, were no longer strangers. They were her family. Her real family. The house was her home, the place where it all began. But she hadn't remembered. Not until now. The figure leaned closer, its cold breath on her skin, and the shadows tightened their grip around her. "You were never meant to leave," it whispered. The words slithered into her mind, a poison that spread through her veins. The memories returned in flashes, broken fragments of a life she had long forgotten. The Bennett family massacre. The night they died. The screams.
The blood.
And her. She had been there. Her hands had been stained with their blood. The truth hit her like a brick, the weight of it crushing her chest. The figure's face remained still, its eyes boring into hers with a haunting intensity. "You are one of us now," it said, its voice calm, almost comforting. "This house belongs to you, just as it belongs to me." Claire tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her mind was screaming, trying to break free of the crushing reality, but there was no escape.
She was part of this.
She had always been part of this. The shadows began to stir once more, swirling around her, feeding on her fear. The figure stood and turned, its silhouette fading into the swirling darkness. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, it spoke once more. "It's your turn to take control." Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and Claire felt herself being pulled forward. The door in the far corner was no longer just a door, it was a passage. A gateway. A way back to where it had all begun. Her hands twitched as she reached for it, but before she could touch the handle, the shadows closed in around her. The memories surged, overwhelming her senses. Her eyes fluttered, the room spinning, her body weightless. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything went black. The whispers lingered in the silence. "It's time," The silence was suffocating. The oppressive darkness closed in around Claire, a thick fog that swallowed her whole. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, desperately clinging to whatever fragments of sanity she had left. But they slipped through her fingers like sand. "It's time." The words echoed, but there was no voice, no source, just the relentless pressure of the shadows, pushing her forward. She couldn't remember when the floor had started to move beneath her. It was like the earth itself was alive, twisting, shifting, reshaping. Her body felt light, almost weightless, as if gravity itself had lost its grip. Her head spun, and she felt herself being pulled, dragged, toward something. A presence. The sensation of the walls closing in again, the air growing colder, denser, suffocating. But then something changed. A flash of light, brief and blinding. Claire's eyes snapped open, but she couldn't see. The light was too bright. Then, slowly, the brightness faded. She was no longer in the room, no longer in the house. She was somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar, but eerily familiar at the same time. The shadows didn't follow her, but their presence lingered, wrapped tightly around her mind. Claire stood in the center of a vast, empty space. It was a room, or at least it looked like one. The walls were jagged, broken, and covered in dark stains. The air reeked of decay, like something long dead and forgotten. And at the center of the room, there was a mirror. A large, cracked mirror. Its surface was dark, reflecting nothing but emptiness. Claire took a step forward, her feet dragging against the cold, damp floor. The mirror seemed to beckon her, pulling her closer, urging her to see, to look. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cracked surface. The glass was warm.
Alive.
She gasped, pulling her hand back. But then, the reflection moved. Not her own. A face she didn't recognize, but one that was so disturbingly familiar. It was covered in blood. The eyes were wide, glassy, lifeless. The face was pale, distorted, twisted in agony. It was someone she had once known. Someone from the past. The reflection in the mirror smiled at her. A grotesque, cruel smile. And Claire's heart stopped. The whisper returned, slithering into her mind. "You've always known who you are." The reflection in the mirror began to move again. Slowly, methodically. Its hands reached out through the glass, stretching toward her. The moment Claire's fingers touched the mirror once more, she was pulled in, sucked into the darkness. And the world she knew shattered. The darkness swallowed her whole, pulling her into an abyss that stretched beyond time and reality. Her body tumbled, weightless, as though she was falling through endless space. No sound, no light, just the disorienting sensation of being ripped apart and reassembled. Claire's mind felt like it was being stretched thin, pulled in all directions at once. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the void. And then everything stopped. The sensation of falling ceased. The weightlessness vanished. She was standing again, only it wasn't the same. The air was thick, like the remnants of a dream half-remembered, and the world around her shimmered. She looked around. The room was gone, replaced by a twisted landscape, a place that felt as if it had been torn out of time itself. The sky above her was black, but not empty. It churned with dark, roiling clouds, as though it were alive, watching her. The ground beneath her feet was cracked, like dried earth, with sharp edges that seemed to claw at the air. And then, from the corners of her vision, figures began to appear. Not people, but shadows. Dark, shifting forms that slithered and crept along the jagged landscape. Claire's heart raced, but she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot. A cold laugh echoed around her, bouncing off the walls of the shifting void. She turned slowly. The figure was standing there. Not the masked figure. Not the creature from the basement. But something else. A A shadow, indistinct, yet somehow familiar. It wore the same mask, but the mask was cracked, distorted. The eyes were hollow, just like hers. The shadow tilted its head, observing her with an eerie calmness. And then it spoke. "Welcome home." The voice was low, distorted, like a memory trying to escape from the depths of her mind. The words felt suffocating, heavy with meaning that Claire couldn't quite grasp. Her breath caught in her throat as the shadow took a step forward. The ground beneath her trembled. "You know who I am." The whisper was cold, but Claire felt it in her very bones. And then everything clicked. Her heart dropped. The shadow was her. The reflection in the mirror, the blood, the mask, it was all her. The truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had always known. She had always been the one who belonged here, in this place, with these shadows. This was where it had started, where it would end. The ground shifted again, pulling her toward the center of the void. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, dragging her down. Her body didn't fight it anymore. It didn't need to. She had come full circle. The house, the massacre, the mystery, it was all part of her. The shadows closed in around her, enveloping her. And she was finally home. The shadows wrapped themselves around Claire like a cloak, heavy and cold, but there was no fear left in her. Only acceptance. She felt the weight of the void, the oppressive stillness that had once terrified her, now strangely comforting. The dark sky above her churned more violently, swirling with an intensity that made the air feel alive, buzzing with energy. The whispers from the corners grew louder, no longer distant murmurs, but a chorus, chanting her name. "Claire?" She turned slowly. There was no real need to move, yet her body obeyed, as if something deeper inside her urged it. The shadow, her shadow, loomed before her. It reached out, its hands long and twisted, but the touch was gentle, almost reverent. It caressed her cheek, and for a moment, she closed her eyes. The ground beneath them cracked again, the earth splitting wide. From the rift, a new presence emerged. Dark, towering, and powerful, its form impossible to define, like a thing made from all the fears and broken pieces of the past. It moved toward Claire, its presence demanding attention, suffocating the air around her. But she didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. The shadow beside her did not move either, as if it was waiting for the moment to come. For her moment. "It's time," the voice whispered again, this time in her mind, clear and final. The space around her began to shift, warping as though time and reality were being bent, twisted by an unseen hand. The void seemed to fracture, breaking apart in jagged, unpredictable patterns. Claire stepped forward, the darkness around her responding to her movement, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. She was in control now. The shadow, no longer a distant figure, had become part of her, an extension of herself that she no longer needed to fight against. The creatures in the distance, the twisted reflections of her own fears, began to retreat, their forms fading into the cracks in the air. She could feel their fear, their reluctance to face her. She had become their master. She had become the darkness. But just as she thought she understood the power that surged through her, a voice, a familiar voice, echoed from the depths of the rift. Remember, it was the same voice that had spoken to her earlier, the voice that had whispered of memories long buried. She felt a stirring within her, like the ripples of a long-forgotten dream. The memory of the massacre, of the night the Bennetts had died, surged within her once more. The faces of her family, twisted, contorted in terror, flashed in her mind. Her hands had been stained with their blood. Her hands had ended their lives. But now she was no longer that person. The new form she had become, this shadow, this force, was something more, something beyond the human that she had once been. She raised her hand, and the world trembled. The rift in the sky widened, and the monstrous form before her stopped. It wasn't fighting. It was waiting. For her. For what she would choose. And Claire realized then that this was her destiny. The massacre had been just the beginning. Now, she was more than the murderer. She was the one who controlled the darkness, who commanded it, who would shape the future of this place. And the future would be hers. The void grew still. The whispers silenced. And Claire, now truly whole, embraced the power that had always belonged to her. The world around Claire shuddered, and for a moment, it seemed as if time itself had paused. The shadow beside her, her shadow, grew more solid, more defined. It was no longer something to fear, but something to wield, a force that now bent to her will. She could feel the weight of the power within her, coursing through her veins, filling her every thought, every pulse. The towering creature in the rift hesitated, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. It had been waiting for her, had always been waiting for her. The roles were reversed now. She wasn't just part of this world. She had become the master of it. Claire looked up, her gaze meeting the swirling, tumultuous sky. The air was thick with energy, crackling with the potential of what was to come. There was no turning back now. The massacre, the whispers, the shadow. Everything had led to this moment. She was no longer a victim of the darkness. She was the darkness. The ground trembled again, the cracks deepening, splitting wider as if the very earth was bowing to her will. From the depths of the rift, more figures began to emerge, but they were no longer monstrous. They were reflections of her, each one wearing a mask, her mask. Faces twisted and contorted, but they were all hers. She reached out, her hand trembling as she embraced the power. The creatures that had once tormented her, the ones she had tried to outrun, now knelt before her, as if acknowledging their new ruler. The rift continued to widen, and she felt the weight of the choice before her. This was her world now, her domain. She had the power to reshape it, to tear it down, to build it in her image. And yet, as the shadows closed in around her, Claire realized that the true darkness was not in the rift. It was within her. She had always known that the Bennetts had died at her hands, but now, she understood, she had always been the one to pull the strings. The massacre was only the beginning of her reign. With a final, resolute step forward, she embraced her fate. The darkness was her kingdom now, and she was its queen. The final ripples of darkness stilled, and Claire stood at the center of the void, her body pulsing with the raw power she had inherited. The shadows that had once tormented her now bowed in submission. She had become their ruler, the force that commanded them, and with it, she could shape this world into anything she desired. But as she stood there, a quiet realization began to settle over her. The chaos that had once defined her journey, the fears, the bloodshed, it all felt distant now. The power that had overwhelmed her, the mask she had worn, no longer mattered. She was not just a figure of darkness. She was a creator. The creatures, once twisted versions of her own fears, began to fade. Their forms melted into the air, leaving nothing but a faint echo behind. The cracks in the sky slowly closed, their jagged edges smoothing out until they were nothing more than the calm surface of a pond. The ground beneath her shifted, the rift closing as well. The trembling ceased. The void that had once stretched out forever was now becoming still, silent. It was as though the entire world, the entirety of this place, was waiting for her to make the next move. Claire took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly. She had become everything she had once feared, and yet, in that moment, she understood the truth. The darkness was not a force to be defeated. It was a part of her. She had always known it, even when she had fought it, resisted it. The house, the Bennetts, the massacre, all of it had been leading her here, to this moment. It had been the beginning of her understanding that she was the force that shaped her fate, not the other way around. And as the final remnants of the rift faded into nothing, Claire stepped forward into the new world she created. A world where shadows and light coexisted, where power was no longer something to fear, but to wield. She was at peace. In the end, it wasn't the darkness that defined her. It was the choice she had made to embrace it. And in that embrace, Claire found her true power. The world around her stood still, and in the silence, she knew the story was finally complete. Her reign had begun.